Welcome to the Humanist Association of Toronto's presentation of Hat Talks, opportunities for members of our humanist community to impart knowledge and stories from their areas of expertise and personal experience. Today we have with us Karen Lynn and Michelle Edmunds, two longtime campaigners from the front lines of adoption right advocacy, who will present their perspectives with origins on two sides of the adoption question. Firstly, we'll hear from Karen Lynn. In her presentation called What Happened?, Karen will lead us on a whirlwind tour through the history of the treatment of unmarried mothers, from the extreme patriarchy of medieval societies up to the present liberated and not so liberated feminist time. Karen will share her own personal story as the pregnant teenager whose own doctor advised her not to tell anyone, to her treatment in a maternity home, how she found her son, and her eventual activism that resulted in successfully defying the Ontario law that mandated secrecy in adoption. And without further ado, Karen Lynn.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks so much. I will share my screen now. There. So thank you everyone for listening. Michelle and I have long discussed how we could share our stories that are linked in a certain way with the world. So what happened to me? November the 20th, 2020, the United Church of Canada apologized. And although the apology is fairly long, this is the preamble which gets the idea across. Within the traditional standards of moral behavior and societal customs in the 1950s and 60s in Canada, the conventional notion of family was firmly established and defined a single family unit to be an adult mother and father. Accordingly, a young unmarried woman with a baby was neither considered to be nor recognized as a responsible parent. The United Church of Canada shares responsibility for shaping the fundamental attitudes of the cultural ethos at that time. It is to our regret that we acted on that conviction that a single woman with a baby couldn't be regarded as a responsible parent. Our participation in separating young unmarried mothers from their newly born children was, we now acknowledge, a practice that caused great harm and hurt, and for that we are truly sorry. So, and recently, the United Church announced that on May the 9th, 2021 at 3 p.m., and that's Mother's Day, the United Church will hold a public service of grief and lamentation in which they will officially apologize. Now to my story. In January 1999, I was running up Yonge Street, heading towards 2 Bloor Street West, the 26th floor. That was the office of the Adoption Disclosure Registry, the gatekeeping arm of the Government of Ontario that separated adopted adults from their mothers and fathers by law. I held in my right hand the key. This was a letter signed by my doctor, ascertaining that my father had died suddenly of a heart attack at age 48. This was the only way the government would authorize a search for my son on my behalf. My son was 35 years old at the time. The provision was called a Health, Safety, and Welfare Priority Search. It took my son a few days to open the letter that they sent, but it worked. Within a few days, he phoned me. And then on February the 27th, 1999, he walked in the door. He was wearing a black t-shirt and blue jeans, and so was I. This is a photo of us a few months later in Halliburton, which seems to symbolize our relationship as it evolved. But the day that he walked in, we sat in my kitchen and the sun streaming in the window onto the table and us. He picked up my hand and asked, "What happened?" It was a very difficult question because I immediately started going to the actual facts that he wanted to know about his birth. But I thought about my story too, what happened, and I was thinking historically. So my son was born in November 1963 in the Toronto General Hospital. They would not allow me to hold my son. I asked to breastfeed him. They would not allow that. And remember, I had committed no crime. Instead, they injected me with DES to stop the creation of breast milk in my body. And I was in shock at the removal of my rights without discussion. I could only look at him through the glass into the nursery. They circumcised him without my permission. Then one day, his bassinet was temporarily moved close to the window on an angle, and I saw a note which said, "Mother does not want to see baby." That is when I started screaming and saying and crying. The nurses scurried and quickly brought him to me. But later, to calm me down, which would suit them, they injected me with sodium amytal. But before that, I was a university student at the University of Toronto, 19 years old, in my first year with a steady boyfriend. When I found out I was pregnant, my doctor said, "You don't have to tell anyone about this." And I thought, that means I must tell everyone, although it did take quite a few years. Maternity homes proliferated in Toronto, and I was sent to one called Armagh, just outside of Toronto. There I met Anne, whose baby was born a couple of weeks before mine. Anne had lied to the matron of the home. And this is what she said. Anne, by the way, already had a profession. She was 24, and she was made to leave her family home by her father. She told the matron that she planned to surrender her baby, but she didn't. She had a different scheme in mind. And the matron said that had she known that Anne was planning to keep her baby, she would have not have let her in. She would not have given her shelter. She would have refused her shelter. That's the power that these people had. But the times were changing. From 1960 to 1970, the percentage of illegitimate births rose from 4.3% to 9.6%. This percentage is greater than it appears. In 1960, the total number of live births in Canada was about 478,500, with 20,413 of those described as illegitimate. But by 1970, the birth rate had fallen. Only 371,988 births were recorded. But of those, 35,500 were illegitimate. This is from Public Attitudes in Canada Towards Unmarried Mother, 50 to 96 and 97, Susan Crawford. How were attitudes changing? In 1968, mother's allowance was introduced in Ontario. So a single mother could keep her child. She could be financially supported. So Ricky Solinger, who wrote Wake Up Little Susie, expressed that emerging women's rights were allowing women to keep their babies. In fact, after Roe versus Wade in 1973, an unintended result was that the number of women keeping their babies increased exponentially. But what happened before 1963? This is a very quick history of the oppression of unmarried mothers. In the medieval world, the church punished both parents for infanticide, and justice was mild, a few days in the stocks perhaps. But later investigations were narrowly focused on the mother. Prosecution was taken over from the church by the state, which proceeded with unprecedented vengeance to zero in on the lewd unwed mother. The zeal to punish unwed mothers was equaled only by the assault on witches, which was occurring at the same time. Punishment was often death, sometimes by torture. In Denmark, the woman was beheaded. In Sweden, she was cast into a fire. In Prussia, she was buried alive with a stake driven through her chest. Moving up quickly to Victorian times, at the bottom rung of the social ladder was the unwed mother, the fallen woman, for whom society provided no options. Her destitution forced her into the kind of basic strangeness that made her unfit for parenting. As in the early modern period, she was required to dispose of her baby. And then, of course, that's where that rhyme evolved from. There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. A story of maternal desperation in urban industrialized poverty. In 1870, there were 276 dead babies found in the streets of London in just 1 year, many left by baby farmers who did not wish to pay funeral expenses. Who were the baby farmers? Did we have any here? Well, in back up to my day, Freud called the unmarried mother neurotic. And in fact, in 1963 in Toronto, there was a conference of psychologists titled The Problem of the Unwed Mother. So there were stories to tell. I would like to tell you the story. Oh, wait a minute. Missed a slide, sorry. Okay, so Ricky Solinger said the world of maternity homes in post-war America was a Gothic attic, obscured from the community by the closed curtains of gentility and high-spiked fences. The girls and women sent inside were dreamwalkers serving time, pregnant dreamwalkers taking the cure. Part criminal, part patient, the unwed mother arrived on the doorstep with her valise and, moving inside, found herself enclosed within an idea. So we have stories. There's a story of Donna, age 16, who, these are people who I know. Donna wandered aimlessly in about, I would say about 1968, 69, in fields, homeless, until she finally gave up and found a maternity home. And Kathy, age 17, in Toronto, she was thrown out onto her family front lawn by her father upon the advice of the parish priest. She wandered around Toronto until she found a maternity home. She was also physically abused by nurses in the Women's College Hospital. Cheryl, age 20, in Toronto, had to attend family court to legally surrender her child. And the judge asked her if she understood the implications. She said yes. She walked out onto University Avenue and threw herself under the first truck that came by. It didn't kill her. The driver, who was driving an Italian fruit truck, crawled under the truck and listened to her story. He could not understand how society could be so cruel to young women. Later, Cheryl married, had more children. Her 13-year-old son on the backseat of a motorcycle was killed. She had to lose another son. When I asked her what was worse, the adoption or the loss of her son, she quickly responded, the adoption. I've met around 10 women who shared similar stories, and they always answered the same way, the adoption. Today, the proposed framework must really be in the best interest of the child. What do I mean? I mean, when we're considering adoption laws, if you put the best interest of the child first, we will finally ensure that human rights are embedded in adoption legislation. Suggestions for human rights laws. 1, the right to raise a child that you bore. 2, the right to know the identities of your genetic parents, your social and geographic history. 3, end coercion and forced adoption, because that's what it was. It was forced adoption. Make no mistake. 4, open adoption is a serious refinement, but it's not the answer. The answer is in number 1, 2, and 3. And finally, a burning question, because adoption is evolving into the use of assisted reproductive technologies. But have we learned the lessons of adoption? Not really, because assisted reproductive technologies are occurring in private clinics. And when they go out of businesses, they operate like private businesses, the records are destroyed. At least in adoption, we have some records to open. Finally, we did open up sealed adoption records in Ontario in 2009. It's not open enough. There are still some disclosure vetoes. But in terms of progress, we're on our way. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Karen, that's a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. We'll, of course, take Q&A at the end of the presentation, at the end of the session. Now I bring to you Michelle Edmunds. Michelle Edmunds will present her personal story. Michelle was taken from her mother in Toronto when she was 2 years old and placed in foster care with a family that eventually adopted her. At age 5, she was told by her adoptive parents that she had another mother and father who were not able to raise her. From that day forward, the search began for her missing parents and her missing identity. Michelle wanted to know who they were, why they never came back, and why she wasn't allowed to know their names, her name. What was the big secret? Over the next 2 decades, Michelle has been involved in adoption reform to unseal adoption records for all adopted persons and their parents. She's researched child welfare legislation and discriminatory adoption practices in both Canada and the US. Please help me welcome Michelle Edmunds.
Richard, thanks for the introduction. And my name is Michelle Edmunds. And I also go by Michelle Louise Brownlee because that was my actual name at birth. My father's name was Howard Brownlee, and my mother named me Michelle Louise. This presentation is called Break On Through to the Other Side, because that's pretty much what it's felt like for the last 45 years, is breaking through to the other side, which is truth. And before we start, just something to consider. What is your understanding of being adopted? A lot of people say, oh, I know someone who was adopted and, you know, they're this and they're that. Well, what is your actual understanding between 0 and 5 of what it's like to be adopted? And then compare that understanding at the end of the presentation. Get a new score. So my adoption, I was taken from my mother and family at age 2 by a children's aid in Toronto. And that's a picture of my adoptive mother. This would have been 1964, definitely shortly after I arrived. There's another picture. You can see I had much older adopted siblings, the biological children of my adoptive family. And so I guess they like to dress me up. And I want to make it understood, I guess, that being loved and happy and cared for does not negate the need or desire to know and be with one's parents and tribe. Why I was adopted, what I was told. I was told that I was given away so my mother could stay in school, and that's why my parents' identities were a secret. It was from the this early 60s, and it was called back then, oh, a girl got herself into trouble. So right away, I thought of myself as trouble. My mother loved me, and that's why she gave me away. That was the other message I was given. So that she loved me so much that she gave me away is a paradox, because who gives away the things they love? I needed to know the real story. I was always searching and living in someone else's reality. At age 5, when I was told I had other parents, I was looking for them automatically. Where are they? If you aren't my real parents, where are they? In my mind, my parents were missing. I wondered endlessly why they never came back, why I couldn't know their names. Who were they? Where were they? I asked multiple women, my next door neighbor. I even asked my older adopted sister if she was my mother. Did I dislike my adoptive parents? No, I was raised in a white middle-class home in Etobicoke. I was cared for and loved. There was dysfunction, no doubt, like there was dysfunction everywhere in all families. There was no more dysfunction in my family than any other family. They're the only family I've known. That doesn't make them more loving than other parents. It doesn't, nor should it have anything to do with me wanting access to my own birth registration. And in 1995, I began the official search for my parents and family. What was I known as? As soon as I decided to search for my parents and I started telling people, I became the ungrateful little bastard. Misperception. There was something wrong with me because I apparently would not accept the adoption story or stories that were given to me. Justify. I have had to constantly justify why I wanted to know my identity and parents. The ungrateful bastard. It was viewed as an insult and disrespectful to my adoptive parents, the ones who saved me from a dismal life, from an abortion or being tossed into a garbage bin, just because I wanted to know who my parents were and what my identity was. The as if born to. This is not reality. You're either born to somebody or you're not. You can't be as if born to. The adopted person's role is to be the daughter or son of the people who adopted them. In most adoptions, the adoptee is the solution to infertility, childless couples. It's a way of building or creating a family. But there's already a mother and a father and a family who cannot simply be erased because of adoption. This is the person's reality. This is what it felt like practically every day of my life. So many unanswered questions, and nobody would give me the answers. Ontario and sealed adoption records, protecting family secrets. The birth registrations, the public denied access, bastard status. Ontario, the Adoption Act implemented in 1921. In 1927, birth registrations are sealed. The sealing of a birth registration was meant to prevent the public from viewing proof of bastardom. So that means when 1927, when birth certificates for adopted people were sealed, it wasn't to protect anybody but the adopted person from the stigma of being born a bastard. It wasn't about privacy for anybody. Also, with a legal name change, a person cannot possess two legal identities. The original name will always be sealed. So if a non-adopted person decides they want to change their name, their original birth certificate will be sealed, and they will not be allowed access to that original birth certificate. If a couple marry and the mother has a 15-year-old daughter, let's say, and the father is going to adopt that daughter's original birth certificate will be sealed. She will not ever be allowed to have that birth certificate. So when birth certificates are sealed, it's not about privacy. It's about not possessing two legal identities. Governments never cared about unwed mothers, as Karen has spoken to, such as awarding her a lifetime of anonymity for a child. There was no such document that promised anything like that. The primary concern was for the foster parents, who are now called adoptive parents, and some issues that could arise if you have a child with a different name from their caregivers is traveling, all legal formalities, inheritance, school, and another reason was to keep the child's mother away from their new family. So it wasn't about privacy for the mother, it was about keeping her away from her child. I believed mothers simply gave away their babies, the choice and confidentiality, until one day I understood the power of the moral majority and the extreme shame associated with sex and pregnancy before marriage. Women, not men, were considered immoral, but she was renewed by surrendering her bastard baby. Her child, the disposable bastard, renewed through adoption. Then I learned about childless couples needing a baby and the adoption industry, and everything made sense. Privacy for mothers is a myth. Looking at my adopted half siblings. My two sisters were raised together in one foster home. Their names are Colette and Mignon. They kept their original identities. They could have picked up the phone and called their mother at any time. But because I was adopted, same mother, same situation, I was not even allowed to know my mother's name. They kept their original names because they were not adopted. Denied information to the adopted people and their parents. Requests denied. Over decades of adopted people and their parents wanting information, the government's response was to create a voluntary disclosure register. This was in early 1980s. The Adoption Disclosure Registry, matching family members upon mutual request. So if I, in writing, sent a request to find out who my mother was, if she didn't put a request in herself, we would not be reunited. What we did get, though, was non-identifying information, such as your mother had brown hair, your mother liked to play the guitar, your mother was Catholic. Thousands of adoptees, we worked around the system to find our parents and mothers and fathers to find their children. Thousands of adoptees and their parents learned how to search without their identifying information. Sometimes there were birth registries, like in the Three Identical Strangers, the documentary about three twins who were separated at birth, adopted by three different families. And they searched the New York City birth registry looking for a woman who gave birth to triplets on their birthday. And that's how they found her, because that would have been very uncommon. Non-identifying information. Your mother had brown hair. Oh, I went through this, sorry about that. Another thing that they told me too was that they thought my mother was thought to have had schizophrenia. It ended up they were wrong. And that I had seven siblings, dates of birth and locations, no names. And I thought these 7 children were kept by my mother. I didn't know that they had all two been adopted or fostered. Advocates tried for decades to get the Ontario government to unseal records, but there was always opposition from politicians, the adoption industry, and the public. Main argument, privacy for mothers, which I described in previous slides, was a myth. There was never, and is still no document guaranteeing anybody privacy. In the media headlines, opposition to unsealing birth registrations. Mothers need to be protected from adoptees. Adoptees will destroy lives. And these are headlines. Adoptees will ruin their lives, meaning mothers. Several birth mothers said they would kill themselves. So you have to wonder how young people, young adopted people, when they see these headlines and hear people talking about this, that they are actually destroyers of lives. Common objections to adoptees and changing laws. but you were loved, right? What about a mother's right to privacy? Well, she gave you away. Why do you want to know who she is? What about your adoptive parents? Your adoptive parents are your real parents, right? But isn't identity what you make it? As long as you're loved, what difference does it make who your parents are? Attitudes, the unspoken trade-off. Adopted people. There's an assumption that because an adopted person was given a family, that their identity shouldn't matter. Get a family, lose a family. Mothers. Her child has a new family, so she can now move on with her life and forget about that child. Secrecy in exchange for a better life. In 2009 in Ontario, birth registrations were unsealed. Adopted people could now receive a non-certified copy of their original birth registration, but there is a disclosure veto and a no contact preference. There's a potential $50,000 fine for breaching this disclosure veto pre-2009 adoption. So that means if you were born before 2009 and you apply for your birth certificate and are denied because your mother or your father or both had their information redacted from your birth registration, and you go out and find them and contact them anyways, you can be charged and or criminally charged. You can be fined $50,000. Human rights. Every non-adopted person has the right to access their own birth information. This is unfair treatment among humans when one group in society is denied the same service as everyone else. So if the person I'm working beside can go to Vital Statistics office and get their birth certificate and I can't, that is discrimination. Human rights means all humans are treated equal. In a study of American adolescents, the Evan Donaldson Adoption Institute found that 72% of adopted adolescents wanted to know why they were adopted. 65% wanted to meet their birth parents. 94% wanted to know which birth parent they look like. The adopted experience. You know or feel that you want to know who your parents are, and searching for them goes against everything you've ever been told by society, institutions, strangers, friends, the media, doctors. Practically every person with whom you have shared your need to know disagrees with you. This is why it takes adopted people so long to search for their families. It feels right, but you're told it's wrong. It's why we reunite with elderly parents or find a grave. Oppression, the emotional and mental acceptance that you should be treated differently. You start to believe it yourself, even though it doesn't feel right. To be grateful for what was given to you, that you really don't deserve what other people have. Family found. My mother had 9 kids with 9 men between 1953 and 1966. She grew up in an orphanage in Halifax from age 6 to 17. She lost her first son to foster. She lost all of her children to foster care or adoption. I found my mother, 4 siblings, and 1 uncle in 1995. My mother died in 1996, 3 months after I physically met her. In 2009, I found a first cousin, Carol, who introduced me to Nova Scotia, my cousins and maternal ancestry. In 2015, I found my father through DNA testing and matching second cousins. He had already died in 2008. There's a picture of my father. I only have 2 pictures, and I guess that's in the 1960s sometime in New Jersey. And that's my mother. I only have 2 pictures of my mother, and that's one of the better ones. That was my father as a child in New Jersey. And this is what my family tree looked like until I was 57 years old. I couldn't fill out my family tree. Adopted people can't even start with themselves. This is what my family tree looks like now. It's full, it's done. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, unless you're adopted. The human desire for genetic connectedness. Conceiving a child or wanting a genetic child is the same desire as me wanting my own genetic parents. People who conceive their own children want to continue their lineage. They want a baby, a child that looks like them or their parents, shares their traits. As an adopted child, I wanted my parents, my genetic parents, for the same reasons. Yet society has sympathy for the parents wanting a child and no sympathy for me. The problem of infertility, the solution of babies of unwed mothers. Since the shame of unwed pregnancy has dissipated in many countries, the adoption industry, adoption agencies reformatted the adoption narrative to the selfless mother sacrificing her child to loving adoptive parents. No longer is it about the shame and blame of having sex out of marriage. This is one adoption agency ad. Birth mother, comma, good mother. The goal of the adoption agency is to get the baby. Healthy white babies sell for around $70,000. Imagine if your child is born, then the hospital accidentally sent 2 babies home with the wrong parents. You learn this 1 year later when your child that you're raising is 1. Would you want your child back? Or would it not matter because your child is loved by the other family? There's one of my half-siblings, Mignon, and my other half-sibling, Colette, my cousin, Carol, and my sister, Mignon, Mimi. My sister, Colette, and my niece, Ashley, her daughter, at Ashley's wedding. Me, in 2000, I guess around 2015, 16, my niece, Chloe. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. On behalf of the Humanist Association of Toronto, I thank Michelle and Karen for their personal stories of anguish and sorrow that motivated them to create the change they wanted to see in the world for themselves and for every other person like them. What an amazing human and humanist message. If you're a HAT member with a story to tell from your experience of expertise or personal experience, we want to hear from you. Please send a brief outline to info@humanisttoronto.ca and you may find yourself presenting the next HAT Talks. Until then, thank you very much.